In this final video, I will address some of the thematic elements of the novel, comment on some of the characters populating it, and assess its role in the broader Dostoevsky corpus. I should mention that several of these comments are indebted to the work of Joseph Frank, and I would commend his biography of our author to anyone interested in diving into these ideas further. Although the plot is entirely fictional, The Insulted and Injured is a surprisingly autobiographical work. As noted earlier, Dostoevsky shamelessly casts an 1840s time slice of himself as the narrator. For, of course, Vanya is the author of Poor Folk, who has since fallen on hard times. When Alyosha enthusiastically throws himself into a new social circle of young political idealists, Dostoevsky is recalling his own participation in the Petrushevsky circle, which ultimately led to his arrest in 1849. At the beginning of the epilogue, our author indulges in a brief excursion to get in a gentle dig at one of his own previous publishers. Alexander Petrovich is thought to represent Andrei Krevsky, who ran the journal Notes from the Fatherland during our author's early career. Later in the epilogue, Vanya makes a frank confession to Natasha. Unlike his rivals who have time to polish their works, but just like Dostoevsky, Vanya is always writing at the last minute, under pressure and in want of money. Indeed, he goes so far as to call himself a hack. All these autobiographical features invite questions about how Dostoevsky viewed his own past from some 15 years previously, how his own ideas had changed since that time, and how he viewed his own work in this very novel. I take Vanya's confession in the epilogue to be Dostoevsky's acknowledgement to the reader that the work he was completing was no masterpiece. This novel was thrown together swiftly, while the bulk of the author's attention was dedicated to editing the journal in which it would appear. It made use of the well-worn narrative tropes of contemporary pulp fiction, and arguably it overreached in its sentimentality in several places. To get a sense of what I mean, you might return to the last couple paragraphs of Part 2, or to Ichmeniev's prayer in the last chapter of Part 4. Later, Dostoevsky would state explicitly that some of his characters needed much more time to develop in the mind than he had available to him to write. Nevertheless, today, with the benefit of hindsight, we can appreciate the virtues of this novel much more deeply than many of his contemporaries were capable of doing at the time. They were expecting a novel of social criticism from the author of Poor Folk. What they got was a transitional work, more psychological than social, from a man who had outgrown his earlier ideas and would later write Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. The thematic core of the novel emerges during the discomfiture of Vanya at the hands of Velkovsky in the last chapter of Part 3. Vanya, of course, is the ever-young Schiller at whom Velkovsky is sticking out his tongue, and during their encounter he has no credible response to the taunts the prince sends in his direction. The prince's thesis is all about egoism, but not just about his own outrageous actions. Rather, he accuses his most strident opponents of being egoists too. We must choose between the amoral egoism of a Velkovsky, who pursues pleasure without constraint, and the moral egoism of his opponents, who pursue various ideals and principles with the aim of being laudatory victors in some virtuous game. It is worth considering the path Velkovsky took to reach this conclusion. In his younger days, he tells us, he pursued philanthropic projects, even opening up a hospital in his village, but grew bored with these diversions while at the same time fearing death. Desperate to suck as much enjoyment out of life as possible before his demise, he abandoned genuine investment in good works, and instead chose to exploit the moral world in a sociopathic way, putting on a noble face in public while helping himself to every liberty possible, no matter the cost to others. In its simplest terms, the formula we see here is this. Atheism, or something like it, combined with self-interest, licenses bad behavior. Many philosophers, both in his day and in ours, would strongly resist this formula. Surely the motivation of self-interest will incline people to cooperate with others to secure the benefits of civilization. This is the promise of contractarian and utilitarian views of ethics, and the 19th century had hopeful proponents of this kind of perspective. But by 1861, Dostoevsky had seen too much of life to be seduced by it. Yes, the prince is happy to cooperate with others and even to nod an affirmation at the moral sentiments of his time. But, as he makes explicitly clear to Vanya, all this is a sham. He is simply using the fashionable mores of the day to get what he wants, even when his desires will destroy the lives of other people. So, here we have the beginnings of a feature that will loom large in the author's great works of the next 2 decades. As early as 1864, Dostoevsky would explicitly oppose the secular ideologies of his day that insisted that human self-interest, when properly guided by social incentives, will invariably lead to good outcomes. Notes from Underground is a direct attack on that idea. But the message from that novella is to some extent anticipated by Valkovsky and others here. Of course, Valkovsky is in a special position. He has unusual power to get away with his villainy. What about the rest of us? Indeed, what about his victims, the ones whose lives are destroyed by people like him? What can you do when you have been cruelly insulted and injured, with little hope for your material welfare? You can, as Valkovsky observes, cloak yourself in moral ideals and gain a kind of consolation from thinking of yourself as an outraged innocent, deserving of better, occupying a high ground that no villainy can possibly take away. As Masloboev puts it, you can whimper and read Schiller. That is the other egoism, and according to Valkovsky, it is no less self-centered than the path he has chosen to take for himself. The novel is generous with its examples of this other egoism. There are 3 characters in particular who manifest it. One of them is the old Nikolai Sergeyevich. The conflict between his love for his daughter and his own pride is presented so intensely that it is almost a caricature. Within a span of a few minutes, he oscillates between stomping on the locket with his daughter's picture and kissing it while on his hands and knees. A letter he has written to his daughter will swing wildly from begging her to come home and excoriating her for her behavior. He offers money for his daughter through Vanya as an intermediary, but is unable to state the intended purpose even to Vanya. Although he could never admit it, the war waging within him is obvious to everyone until the outcome is decided in the final pages of Part 4. Where does this pride come from? We get a sense of Ichmeniev's character early on, with the backstory provided in Part 1 of the novel. Nikolai Sergeyevich was, our narrator tells us, quote, one of those very simple-hearted and naively romantic men who are devoted with their whole soul to anyone to whom, God knows why, they take a fancy, unquote. And so the man easily fell under the sway of the charming and manipulative Valkovsky while still in the provinces. Indeed, as Valkovsky gloats later on, Ichmeniev went out of his way to deceive himself regarding the rumors of the prince's seducing a shepherdess and beating her outraged husband to death. He simply refused to believe the story for 12 years out of devotion to his idol. But it is this naively romantic soul which is so terribly embittered when it is disappointed. And so, once the prince reveals his true colors, the old man's hostility to Velkovsky reaches a fever pitch, first in the provinces, and then with redoubled intensity in Petersburg, after Natasha's apparent betrayal. In Part 2, Chapter 10, when Ichmeniev's wounded dignity prompts him to suggest challenging Velkovsky to a duel, Vanya correctly accuses the man of egoism. A duel, after all, would prevent the marriage that could restore Natasha's good name. Ichmeniev insists that she should spit upon the opinion of the world and hold her head aloft in noble pride, the same pride that he desperately wants to regain for himself. The man's desire to win the moral game thus prompts him to suggest a course of action that would harm the very person he loves most. And without the intervention of Nellie toward the end of the novel, he may well have abandoned her to a miserable fate altogether. Thankfully, that disaster is avoided. But in the case of Nellie's mother, the egoism of the wounded romantic completes its course. It is Masloboev in the epilogue who gives the most complete description of her psychology, after he reveals that she was legally married to the prince and thus legally entitled to much of his wealth. Why should she take the self-destructive path and live in squalor, forcing her own child to do the same? His answer, quote, "From the very beginning she dreamed of something like a heaven upon earth, of angels. Her love was boundless, her faith was limitless, and I'm convinced that she went mad afterwards, not because he got tired of her and cast her off, but because she was deceived in him, because he was capable of deceiving her and abandoning her, because her idol was turned into clay, had spat on her and humiliated her." Unquote. So, as her response, quote, "She broke all ties, tore up all her papers, spat upon his money, refused it as so much dirt in order to crush her seducer by her spiritual grandeur, to look upon him as having robbed her, and to have the right to despise him all her life." Unquote. Nellie's mother, then, is just like Ichmeniev, even though they are playing different roles in the parallel plot lines. With respect to the plot, Ichmeniev is supposed to be like Smith, while Nellie's mother is the analog to Natasha. But with respect to character, they are very similar. Each of them has been charmed by the prince. Each of them is a romantic soul. Each of them has been sharply injured by his or her previous idol. Each of them cloaks himself or herself in moral ideals in response to the injury, and each of them, at least at times, is willing to allow harm to a dear loved one in order to preserve his or her sense of moral superiority. The third of our romantics is, of course, Nellie herself. Her path is different. She was never a starry-eyed dreamer who was subsequently cruelly disappointed, although she does remember happiness while Heinrich was still alive. Rather, she inherits the bitter dregs of the romanticism of her mother. In fact, she may have internalized her mother's bitterness more deeply than her mother ever intended. During her recounting of her backstory in the closing stages of Part 4, Nellie insists that her mother had instructed her never to go to him, that is, the prince, at any point in her life, even when she becomes orphaned. But on the very last page of the epilogue, when we get to read an excerpt from the letter penned by Nellie's mother, a letter Nellie had been carrying with her all this time, we get a different story. In that letter, Nelly's mother states that she had instructed Nelly to go to the prince and to claim what is due her. The inconsistency of these two narratives suggests that Nelly has chosen to remember her mother's bitterness more than her actual instructions, maybe even altering her memories to preserve it. Certainly that bitterness is readily apparent in Nelly's attitudes and actions through the course of the novel. We can expect her to rave intractably while under Bubnov's thumb, but even when she comes to live with Vanya, she finds it extremely difficult to accept his charity. She insists that she will be a work girl, sweeping his apartment and making him soup to earn her keep. When the kindness of her host becomes intolerable for her, she runs off from him to try to earn her way with the Masloboevs. She claims that, in the last case of desperation, which she has known, it is not a sin to beg from all, which she takes to be an honest way of gaining money. But she cannot endure being at the mercy of an individual. When this tempest within her reaches a climax, and she runs from Vanya a second time to beg in the streets, our narrator says that she is exemplifying the egoism of suffering. This language is not accidental. In fact, it is italicized in the text. This is not the first time Dostoevsky has played with the idea, nor would it be the last. Arguably, it might appear as early as his 1847 novella, The Landlady, and it would be put on display in a famous way in Notes from Underground. But this is the first time he explores it in detail, and here it is presented as an effect of frustrated romanticism. When she runs away from Vanya, Nelly is certainly not begging out of material need. Rather, she demands a way of asserting herself against the kindness of others, carrying out her role as the noble but tragically denigrated romantic hero, as though she is the spectre of her deceased mother. These characters explain why it is that The Insulted and Injured could never succeed as a social novel or a novel contrived for political ends. The suffering of these people cannot be blamed entirely upon unjust social systems that grind their victims to dust. Velkovsky is indeed a cause of their misery, but their suffering is magnified by their own internal struggles as they behave in ways that are clearly self-destructive. There is another character in the novel who behaves self-destructively, and whose motivations might be analyzed as egoistic. That is, of course, Natasha. In Part 1, Chapter 8, as she walks off to meet Alyosha, which will create the rift with her parents, Vanya rattles off all the ways in which her decision will lead to disaster. She knows that he is right and does not challenge any of his arguments. The furthest she goes to justify her action is simply this. Quote, "What can I say to you, Vanya? You see, he told me to come, and here I am waiting for him." Unquote. I would have said that this justification is so flimsy as to make Natasha's decision utterly unbelievable. That is, if it hadn't been replicated so many times in real life. Affairs of the heart often provoke behavior that baffle the mind, and so perhaps Dostoevsky's portrayal is not so unbelievable after all. It is not until Part 4, Chapter 6, on the eve of Alyosha's departure, that we get a fuller picture of Natasha's feelings for the young man-child. As she is sifting through the history of her crumbling romance, she confesses to Vanya, quote, "Almost from the first time I met him, I had an overwhelming desire that he should be mine at once, and that he should not look at anyone, should not know anyone but me." Unquote. This sort of possessiveness in erotic love is not unusual, and indeed it might be one of its distinguishing features. But in Natasha's case, we see it take on a curious flavor. She actually took a kind of pleasure at the injuries she suffered at his hands, largely because of the bliss she got out of the process of forgiving him. That element makes her go so far as to say that she wanted to be abused. Quote, "The worse he treated me, the better." Unquote. So we have with Natasha a kind of egoism of possession, which is typical with erotic love, but also a variation on the egoism of suffering. This latter feature isn't presented in the same way as it is with Nellie. It is not the dregs of the frustrated romantic, but it is there. Natasha is one of the stronger characters of the novel, but she, too, is facing an inner struggle with her own desires. A less interesting version of egoism concerns Masloboev. We might describe it as the expected egoism of an enterprising capitalist. Like any astute capitalist, and unlike our romantics, Masloboev holds that the value of something is simply whatever another party is willing to pay for it. So, in the epilogue, we get to see a funny contrast between him and Vanya. Well, Vanya is ecstatic to get 50 rubles from his publisher for painstaking labor. Masloboev is furious with himself for accepting only 2,000 for a bit of blackmail. Like any astute capitalist, he also typically has material interests of his own when he acts, and he makes this fact clear to Vanya throughout the novel. Sometimes, as we see in the epilogue, those interests line up nicely with his desire to promote the welfare of the innocent. But since he is caught up in the employ of the prince, these goals will often conflict, and he must chart a middle course. We can see him struggling mightily with this task during Vanya's visit to his home in Part 3, Chapter 6. Of the 6 characters just mentioned, one of them is deceased by the novel's opening. One of them shamelessly has no goal of abandoning his villainous libertinism, and another is destined to play a natural and expected balancing act between competing goals throughout his life. But the other 3 face a struggle of the will that constitutes the primary movement of the novel. Is Velkovsky's thesis that we must choose between kinds of egoism true? If not, how is it to be refuted, and how is it that we can conquer ourselves? 2 characters attempt to put our solution into words. Nellie describes it in terms of the gospel message. When she chastises Ichmenyev in Part 4, Chapter 4, for not forgiving his daughter, she reminds him of the meaning of Easter, which is just around the corner. Later, when she gives her backstory in the closing chapters of Part 4, she tells how she reminded her grandfather of the gospel story about how Christ instructed us to love and to forgive one another. Natasha is more explicit about the force that can save them. In Part 1, Chapter 15, when Vanya exhorts her to return to her parents and ask for forgiveness, she wisely recognizes that her father is not yet ready for her to do so. Rather, quote, "We shall have to work out our future happiness by suffering, pay for it somehow by fresh miseries. Everything is purified by suffering." Unquote. And so these characters do suffer in a particular way. It is the suffering of the soul that makes one capable of Christian love. The various agonies of Ichmenyev are well documented throughout the novel. I confess that I find the moment of his final surrender in the last 2 chapters of Part 4 to be a bit clumsily handled. But the timing comes right after he has endured a rapid crescendo of indignities in Part 4, Chapter 5. Thus battered, we can watch as the old man's proud resolve is chipped at during Chapters 7 and 8 during Nellie's speech, until the dam finally breaks. For Natasha, the suffering continues in a steady stream as she walks up and down her room, tortured by Alyosha's neglect and his obvious infatuation with Katya. The moment of surrender comes when she finally gives him up for the sake of his happiness. The woman whom she had thought of as a bitter rival in Part 3, Chapter 4, is finally recognized to be the only reasonable wife for Alyosha, and by the time of her interview with Katya, the decision had already been decided in her mind. But arguably, the best portrayal of this kind of suffering comes with Nellie. In her case, the question is whether the young girl could ever be capable of receiving the love of another. The journey that she takes in parts 2 through 4 is one of the best examples of the author's psychological skill that we see in the novel. As mentioned already, she puts up a remarkable fight, but a thoroughly believable one, given her history with her mother and the rough handling she receives at the hands of Madame Bubnov. Only slowly are her walls broken down by the inexorable kindness of others around her, first by the doctor, and only later by the one she loves the most, our narrator, Vanya. In her case, though, the victory is incomplete. She does indeed become capable of giving and receiving love, but in the final pages of the novel, it becomes clear that she can never forgive Velkovsky, and that the command of Christ to forgive our enemies is not something she can fully obey. So she dies clinging to that last vestige of bitterness. Nevertheless, Dostoevsky is clear in his refutation of Velkovsky's thesis. It is not the case that we must choose our favorite flavor of egoism. There is such a thing as Christian love, but it takes surrender, and perhaps suffering, to be capable of giving or receiving it. Of the characters I have not yet discussed, 2 deserve special mention. The first is the remarkable figure of Alyosha. He might strike the reader as infuriatingly idiotic, a feather-headed fool. He is always the last one to predict his own behavior. To everyone else, he is an open book. Early on, as he is carrying away Natasha, he insists that he will soon marry the girl, but his plans for doing so are so half-baked that a shared glance between Vanya and Natasha communicate their conviction that he will do no such thing. In our last image of him, he is riding off in a carriage, shouting back to his friend that he would certainly return to Petersburg within 2 days. But everyone else knows perfectly well that he will never see Natasha again, and have planned accordingly. And so it goes throughout the novel. Alyosha worries that others think him stupid. In fact, I don't believe he has an IQ problem. What he has is an extraordinary naivety, an enthusiastic belief in everything he is encountering at the moment. Thus, everything he is not experiencing at the moment fades into insignificance for him. He looks at his Natasha and feels the conviction that he absolutely must marry her, but has no sense of the things that must be done off the stage to make it happen. He goes to a meeting of young political idealists and is instantly won over, heart and soul, but has no sense of the practical problems that this circle will face. He comes face to face with a charming young woman and immediately falls in love, forgetting that his dalliance with some young Minna is incompatible with his relationship with Natasha. For Alyosha, out of sight, out of mind. Scholars sometimes suggest that Alyosha is a kind of rough draft for Prince Mishkin, the saintly protagonist of his great novel, The Idiot. For myself, I find it hard to get fully on board with the comparison. Alyosha's various infidelities, the occasional aristocratic coarseness and insensitivity, which Vanya complains of, and the thoughtless and clumsy destruction of Natasha's life make it impossible for me to think of Alyosha as a saint. Nevertheless, these two figures do share a significant and remarkable feature. Katya speaks truthfully when she tells Vanya during their lengthy interview that there is no falsehood in Alyosha. Indeed, there could not be. To be disingenuous or deceptive, one would have to believe in something off the stage with greater sincerity than one feels toward what is on it. One would have to disbelieve in the current state of affairs. That is not possible for Alyosha. He embraces everything he sees and believes everything he says. He is not lying when he says that he loves Natasha, and he is not lying when he says that he loves Katya. Nor does he disingenuinely fall for Minna or all the other mistresses he has. He genuinely falls for all of them. Infidelities aside, that is perhaps the greatest similarity with Mishkin, the astonishing honesty and sincerity. When Dostoevsky writes Mishkin years later, he builds on that foundation. Finally, we should spare a moment to consider Vanya, our narrator. There is no question that Vanya represents the author's reimagining of his earlier self. In this way, Vanya plays the same role as the narrator of The Village of Stepanchikovo. In each case, the narrator is a young man who begins the story with a touch of naivety, which is challenged as he encounters elements of life that simply don't fit his preconceived ideas. Unlike the narrator of Stepanchikovo, Vanya comes across as a very capable man, moving through sticky social situations competently, perceiving complications in the social scene acutely, and is in over his head only in his tete-a-tete with the prince at the end of Part 3. For those familiar with Dostoevsky's biography, the portrayal of Vanya's social skill is out of keeping with the author's own social awkwardness in the 1840s. Further, his prior work, Poor Folk, is still treated with respect. All the good characters of The Insulted and Injured are appropriately sensitive to what Vanya is trying to do in Poor Folk, even if some of them, like Nikolai Sergeyevich, are mystified by it at first. Only the villainous Velkovsky disparages it. At no point does Dostoevsky suggest that Vanya is mistaken in his fundamental convictions or values. But when he encounters the prince, or for that matter, when he encounters Nellie, or the seedy elements of the criminal underground, Vanya finds himself in uncharted waters, and he comes to learn about chaotic currents of the soul of which he had never previously been aware. So, too, had the author. The Dostoevsky of the 1840s, talented as he was, could not have written The Insulted and Injured. The man who emerged out of the prison camp in Siberia could, and then he would go on to explore those currents in astonishing ways in the 1860s and 70s. In his portrayal of Vanya, Dostoevsky seems to be signaling that he is conscious of his own prior innocence and is announcing that his creative well now runs deeper than it previously did. There is more to pull out of this novel, but the time has come for me to land the plane. I am undecided about the next steps for this channel, since we are coming up to thoroughly covered territory in Dostoevsky's career, and I am not sure about whether the modest improvements I can make on what is already available for free, to the extent that I can make them at all, will be worth the time commitment. But if I find that I simply can't kick my addiction, my next port of call will likely be The House of the Dead, which Dostoevsky wrote concurrently with The Insulted and Injured, and finished publishing in the following year. But our current Let's Read is at an end. Per usual, if you find these comments to be inaccurate or incomplete, Please feel free to improve upon them in the comments section below. I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the experience.